Okay, in this tutorial we're going to start working with our HTML elements. So I'm going to go ahead and I've closed my CSS file because I don't really need it at this point. So we're just going to work through some basic elements, starting to put some things together so we can start working with our building our web page. So you see how we've got our doc type, we have our minimal document elements, we have the HTML element opening and closing. Nested inside the HTML element, we have the head element that has the title, which is mandatory, and then we have our external CSS file. Then in our body element, we just have a standing sort of H1 now that says hello world. And I'm going to go ahead and leave my background color red, not that I particularly care for that design of that, but just to show that it's connected. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to start sort of building the HTML elements on the page. So typically on a website, right at the top, you're going to have the name of your site. So I'm going to change this to my site. And I'll refresh that, and we'll see that reflected there. And then underneath that H1, because these are block elements, I'm going to make an H2 header. And I'm going to put in there tagline goes here. And I'm just going to be just dummy text. And so when I refresh the browser, of course, we see that there. Now, one thing to point out here, you remember the purpose of CSS was to separate the presentation from the actual content. But there's some residual things. These certain elements have certain sort of presentation elements that are sort of exist with the elements by default. Now what we're going to do in a later tutorial is demonstrate how to zero all those out, and we can start that from scratch. So we see now sort of the semantic value that the H1 has more semantic value than the H2, and that's why it's larger. And we also see the space here. So when you're first learning, it's a little easy to get well, sort of thinking that the presentation is in the style, but these are really just sort of display elements that are set by default in the characteristics of the elements themselves. So we can always override these. So for instance, I could always make the my site and tagline have the exact same size as far as presentation, but when a search engine, for instance Google, is looking at your site, it's going to recognize that the H1 actually has more value. And the same thing happens when you're sort of designing for accessibility. The accessibility software that renders the site for people who are sight impaired or maybe hearing impaired or whatever, is that it's going to tell them that the my site is obviously the H1 and then the tagline is H2. So that's good. So I'm going to go ahead and create some space here. And I'm going to put some of just the basic elements that always exist on web pages or on a website. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a UL for my navigation. Close the UL. Inside ULs you have the list item element, so I'm going to open and close the LI. And I'm going to put menu 1 in there for now. Then I can just sort of copy and paste this. Change these numbers. Now I'm going to go ahead and do this just to show you what this looks like. And then when I refresh the page, we see it's an unordered list in that default styling that comes with the unordered list that will override eventually when we get to our CSS. And what I'm going to do now, just sort of prepare you for the midterm, is that I understand that you have to have a home navigation there, and then you need to have an about navigation. So I'm just going to go ahead and change those elements just to demonstrate how simple that is. And what I want to do now, you can see you can always add LIs. But what I'm going to go do is go ahead and add an anchor element, an ahref, to my navigation, because we'll eventually use those. For now, since we're not working with any other pages, I'm just going to leave the value in the href attribute blank for now. Just so we can come back to that later. So I've added that anchor element to the home menu item. So if I refresh that, we're going to see now it's a hyperlink. And if you don't provide a value, it's just going to refresh the page. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this opening tag of the anchor element to these other menu items. And I'm going to add the closing tags. So refresh that. So we see the beginnings of our menu. Of course, the presentation is not what we want because we're going to do that later with CSS. So we have our My Site, then we have our tagline, and then underneath there we have an unordered list, which will eventually become our sort of navigation for the page. Underneath there, I'm going to go ahead and add an let's do let's just give it an H2 element. And this will be where the story headline goes. So I'll add that, save it, refresh it. You see the elements are starting to appear on the page as we write the markup. And then maybe, we want to have sort of a descriptive deck or sort of a subhead. So I'm going to go ahead and give it an H3, and I'm going to put my deck / subtitle, or I'll just lid deck. We're in journalism. That's what the term typically is for that. So deck goes here. So I'll close that. Refresh that. And again, sort of the elements are appearing, but again, they're not styled. So I'm going to go ahead and add a couple paragraph elements. And I'm just going to slam some home keys here just so we get some text. And then I'll go ahead and copy that paragraph element a couple times just so we can kind of see what the content looks like on an unstyled page. So that's starting to look pretty good. And then typically we're going to have a footer at the bottom. So what I'm going to do here is start just adding the content for my copyright. So I'm going to go ahead and give that an H5. And it is sort of arbitrary at this point, but we do want to make sure all our markup has sort of makes sense semantically. This is part of search engine optimization. So I'm going to go ahead and put my site, because that's the name of my site, and I'm going to do copyright 2012. And then I'll close the element. And I know for your midterm you're going to have all these elements on the page, so hopefully this is helpful for you. I'm going to go ahead and give it a copyright symbol. And I'm going to go ahead and do the ampersand and copy. And I'll explain that in class. So now if I refresh the page, you see it adds the copyright symbol. So that's just some basic markup. Again, we can go in here, we can add an anchor element around here, we could use any of the elements that we needed for the page, but right now we're just sort of building up our page, and then in the next tutorial I'm going to start introducing the concept of divs and IDs, and we're going to start styling our page so we start working on the layout of the page. So that concludes this tutorial.